My daughter gave a speech at her graduation and thanked her mother and stepdad for never giving up on her. I had been the one who worked 2 jobs to keep her in school, the one who sat in silence every time she called me strict or cold. I didn't react during the ceremony. What happened next shocked everything. I will tell you everything. Before we continue, support us by clicking on the like button, tell us in the comments section where you are watching us from, and click on the subscribe button so that you don't miss our big story tomorrow. Now let me tell you what happened from the beginning. We want to thank the people who never gave up on us, my daughter said into the microphone, her voice steady, practiced. The room leaned in. Chairs creaked. Someone behind me sniffled. My mom and my stepdad were always there, pushing me, believing in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. Applause broke out immediately, loud, generous, unrestrained. I didn't move. I kept my hands folded in my lap, fingers pressed together like I was holding something fragile that no one else could see. I stared at the stage, at her cap tilted slightly to the side, at the confident way she smiled into the lights. I felt the sound hit me in waves, not sharp, not cruel, just final. In that moment, I understood something had shifted, and I knew I wasn't going to correct it. Whatever came next would happen quietly. I had prepared myself not to be mentioned. That was the part people never understood. I didn't sit there expecting gratitude, or even acknowledgement. Years earlier, I had accepted my role as the background figure, the one who paid, enforced rules, and absorbed resentment without ceremony. Still, preparation didn't dull the impact. It only made the silence heavier. Around me, parents stood to clap, leaning into the celebration. A woman in front of me turned halfway around, smiling warmly, mistaking my stillness for humility. I nodded back, polite, contained. Inside, memories surfaced uninvited. Alarm clocks at 4:30 a.m., the hum of fluorescent lights during late shifts, envelopes labeled tuition, tucked into drawers like promises. I reminded myself I was here to watch her graduate, not to be seen. Even then, a thought flickered, unsettling, insistent, that this applause would cost her something later. When she stepped away from the podium, the ceremony rolled on as if nothing remarkable had happened. Names were read. Diplomas were handed over. Cameras flashed in rhythmic bursts. I clapped when appropriate, stood when the crowd stood, sat when they sat. I followed the script. But every few minutes, something pulled at my attention. A vibration in my pocket from a group text I didn't open, a cough from the row behind me, the sharp scent of perfume as someone squeezed past. These small interruptions grounded me, kept me from drifting too far into the past. I had learned, over time, that dwelling too long on what hadn't been said could turn into a kind of self-pity I couldn't afford. Still, I made a quiet note to myself. This was the last time I would sit through something like this without changing how the story ended. I remembered the first time she called me strict. She was 14, standing in the kitchen with her arms crossed, accusing me of not understanding her. I had just told her she couldn't go out on a school night because her grades were slipping. Her mother had sighed loudly from the other room, the sound of disapproval floating in like smoke. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply said no and went back to washing dishes. That pattern repeated itself for years. I became the wall she pushed against, the obstacle that made her feel constrained. I was cold, according to her, unemotional, difficult. What she never saw, and what I never explained, was how much energy it took to keep saying no while still writing checks, still showing up, still making sure the lights stayed on. By the time the ceremony ended, I knew those interpretations had calcified into truth for her, and I also knew I was done trying to soften them. After the graduates were dismissed, the auditorium erupted into movement. Families surged forward, calling names, waving bouquets. My phone buzzed again, this time a short message from a coworker. How did it go? I typed back, she did great, and meant it. When I finally reached her, she hugged me briefly, distracted, already being pulled toward her mother and stepfather for photos. I stood back, hands in my pockets, watching them cluster together, heads close, laughter spilling easily. Someone asked me to take a picture. I did. The phone felt warm in my hand, the screen bright. I framed them carefully, made sure everyone was in focus. As I handed the phone back, Her mother thanked me casually, the way you thank someone for holding a door. I nodded. In my chest, something settled into place. Not anger, not grief, but resolution. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't need to. Tom would do that for me. On the drive home, traffic crawled, and the radio droned on about nothing important. I replayed her speech once, then forced myself to stop. I had learned the danger of rehearsing moments like that, how they could grow teeth if you fed them too long. Instead, I focused on the road, on the red lights changing to green, on the steady rhythm of driving. A notification popped up from my bank app, routine, automated. I dismissed it without reading, but the image of numbers and dates lingered in my mind. There were commitments attached to those numbers, plans extending months into the future. I thought about how easily people assumed continuity, how gratitude often looked backward while entitlement faced forward. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had already decided that some things would not continue the way everyone expected. I didn't tell myself why yet. I just acknowledged the decision existed. That evening, the house felt unusually quiet. I folded the graduation program and slid it into a drawer with old report cards and certificates I had never thrown away. I sat at the kitchen table longer than necessary, listening to the refrigerator hum, the clock ticking too loudly. Another text came through, this one from my daughter, asking what time we'd meet for dinner the next day. I replied with a neutral answer, no emojis, no commentary. It struck me how much effort neutrality took, how it was mistaken for indifference when it was actually restraint. I wondered briefly if she noticed that I hadn't said anything about her speech. Then I dismissed the thought. If she had noticed, she hadn't cared enough to ask. That realization didn't hurt the way it once would have. It clarified something instead, like finally reading fine print you'd ignored for years. Lying in bed later, sleep came slowly. My mind drifted through practical details. The next work shift, errands I needed to run, deadlines. These mundane thoughts steadied me. They reminded me that my life existed beyond her milestones. At some point, I pictured her checking her bank account in the coming days, the way she always did before big expenses, confident everything would be there. The image wasn't vengeful. It was simply factual. I knew there would be a moment when she'd have to look elsewhere for reassurance, for support she believed was guaranteed. I also knew that when that moment came, it would force a conversation we'd avoided for years. I didn't plan it yet. I just acknowledged that silence had run its course. And as I finally drifted off, I accepted that whatever followed this applause would be irreversible. 2 days later, my phone buzzed while I was standing by the loading dock at work, the air sharp with the smell of oil and cardboard. The message was short, casual, and utterly confident. Hey, did the school money clear yet? I stared at the screen longer than necessary, letting forklifts pass, letting the noise swallow my initial reaction. There was no please, no thank you, no acknowledgement of the ceremony that had just passed. Just an assumption wrapped in familiarity. I didn't reply right away. I slid the phone back into my pocket and went back inside, already aware that this question, so small, so routine, was pointing toward a decision I had been circling for years and would soon stop avoiding. That text followed me through the rest of the day, hovering in the background of every task. As I worked, I thought about how money had become our most reliable form of communication. We rarely talked about feelings anymore. We talked about deadlines, deposits, and due dates. When she needed reassurance, she checked her balance. When she needed stability, she assumed I would provide it. I remembered every conversation where I had been labeled distant because I didn't gush, because I didn't cushion rules with endless explanations. What no one ever counted was how often I said yes silently. Yes to overtime, yes to exhaustion, yes to being misunderstood, so she wouldn't have to worry about logistics. Standing there, I realized gratitude, for her, had a memory problem. It remembered encouragement and forgot sacrifice. That understanding didn't harden me, but it did focus me. During my lunch break, a coworker sat across from me, unwrapping a sandwich and nodding toward my phone when it buzzed again. I told him, vaguely, about the graduation and the upcoming tuition payment. He listened longer than most people did, then asked a simple question, when does it end? I laughed reflexively, brushing it off, But the question lingered after he walked away. When did it end? I had never defined an endpoint because doing so felt like abandonment. Yet here I was, still being treated like a resource rather than a parent. I checked my phone again, another message this time, lighter in tone, joking about how expensive adulthood was. I felt a flicker of something close to resentment, but it passed quickly, replaced by clarity. An ending wasn't abandonment. It was structure. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, bills spread out in neat rows like evidence. I logged into my bank account, not with urgency, but with intention. The numbers were familiar, the scheduled payments predictable. I scrolled through the upcoming transfers, including the final tuition installment and the apartment deposit tied to her master's program. Seeing them laid out like that, I felt the weight of continuity pressing down on me. These weren't just payments. They were promises I had never explicitly made but was expected to keep. My phone chimed with a news alert, breaking the silence. I closed it without reading. There was nothing happening out there that mattered more than what I was deciding in here. I told myself, clearly, that this would be the last time I looked at these transactions as obligations instead of choices. I thought back to a conversation from years earlier, one of the few times I had tried to explain myself. I had told her that being strict wasn't the same as being uncaring, that consistency was how I showed love. She had rolled her eyes, accused me of making excuses. I remembered how small that made me feel, not because she disagreed, but because she refused to listen. Over time, I stopped explaining. Silence became easier, less risky. Sitting there now, I understood that my silence had trained her to believe my support was unconditional and endless. That realization stung, but it also freed me. I didn't need to correct the past to change the future. I just needed to act differently. And I knew, with a certainty that surprised me, that she would feel this change immediately. Later that night, she called. I let it ring twice before answering, controlling the impulse to sound defensive or apologetic. She chatted about post-graduation plans, about how relieved she was to be done, about the apartment she was excited to move into once the deposit finalized. I listened, responding with neutral affirmations, offering no new promises. At one point, she paused and asked if everything was okay. I told her I was just tired. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The whole truth was heavier, more disruptive than either of us was ready for. When we hung up, I felt the familiar pull to fix things preemptively, to reassure her. I resisted it. I had learned that reassurance given too early only delayed necessary discomfort. The next morning, I woke before my alarm, the decision from the night before still intact. There was no dramatic resolve, no surge of anger, just a steady sense of inevitability. Over coffee, I checked my email and found a generic message from the university reminding students about upcoming payment deadlines. The timing felt pointed, almost mocking. I closed the email and stared out the window, watching a neighbor load groceries into their car. Life moved on, indifferent to my internal debate. That indifference steadied me. I realized that nothing catastrophic would happen if I stepped back. The world wouldn't collapse. She would be forced to confront gaps she'd never had to notice before. I didn't see that as cruelty anymore. I saw it as honesty. By mid-afternoon, another text came through from her. This one less casual, asking directly if I had seen the tuition reminder. I typed a response, deleted it, typed another, deleted that too. Finally, I sent a simple acknowledgement without commitment. The restraint felt unnatural, like learning to write with my non-dominant hand. But it also felt right. I could almost hear the future argument forming, the accusations that would come when expectations weren't met. I braced myself for them, not with dread, but with acceptance. I knew this chapter of our relationship was approaching its breaking point, and I also knew I wouldn't rush to smooth it over this time. That night, as I prepared for bed, I opened my bank account one last time, hovering over the scheduled payments. I didn't act yet. I just looked, letting the reality of what I was about to do settle fully. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't punishment. It was a boundary that should have existed long ago. I closed the laptop and turned off the light, aware that the next step would be irreversible. Somewhere between exhaustion and resolve, I understood that the story she told about who supported her would soon be tested by reality. And when that happened, there would be no applause to soften the truth. I pressed cancel and watched the confirmation message appear, clean and impersonal, as if it had nothing to do with my life at all. There was no dramatic sound, no warning banner, just a brief line of text confirming that the scheduled payments had been removed. Tuition, apartment deposit, both gone in less than a second. I didn't rush to close the screen. I sat there, laptop open, coffee cooling beside me, letting the moment settle into my body. What surprised me wasn't guilt or fear, but steadiness. My hands didn't shake. My chest didn't tighten. It felt less like an act of rebellion and more like correcting a long-standing clerical error. Somewhere deep down, I knew this decision had been made years ago. I was only now catching up to it. For a while, nothing happened. The house stayed quiet. The morning light shifted across the kitchen floor, moving on without ceremony. I went through my routine, showered, dressed, packed my lunch. Half expecting some immediate consequence, some interruption that would signal I'd crossed a line. There was none. That absence felt instructive. I realized how often I'd imagined disaster whenever I considered pulling back, how I'd convinced myself that my constant presence was the only thing holding everything together. Standing there tying my shoes, I understood that assumption had kept me locked in place far longer than necessary. Still, I knew this calm wouldn't last. It never did. And when it broke, it would do so loudly. At work, I stayed busy on purpose, giving my hands something to do so my mind wouldn't wander too far. Every time my phone vibrated, I felt a brief flicker of anticipation, not dread, exactly, but readiness. Hours passed with nothing more than routine notifications and group messages that had nothing to do with me. The delay was almost unsettling. I imagined her going about her day, confident, unaware that the safety net she'd relied on had quietly been folded away. That image wasn't satisfying. It was sobering. I reminded myself that boundaries didn't need to announce themselves to be valid. They only needed to hold. During my break, I checked the time and calculated when she might log into her account. She was meticulous about finances when they benefited her, checking balances before purchases, confirming deposits with almost ritual consistency. I pictured the moment of confusion, the refresh, the second login, the tightening in her voice when she realized something was wrong. I didn't relish it, but I also didn't flinch from it. For years, I'd absorbed her discomfort so she wouldn't have to sit with it. This time, I let the discomfort belong where it originated. That shift felt like stepping out of a role I'd never auditioned for, but had performed flawlessly anyway. The call came that evening, later than I expected. I was halfway through reheating leftovers when my phone rang, her name lighting up the screen. I turned the stove down before answering, giving myself a second to settle my voice. The first thing I heard was her breathing, quick, uneven. She didn't bother with small talk. "What did you do to my money?" she demanded, the words sharp enough to cut through the room. I leaned against the counter, listening without interrupting as she listed consequences I already knew about: deadlines, penalties, embarrassment. She spoke as if I were an employee who had made a mistake, someone who needed to fix it immediately. I waited until she paused, then told her calmly that nothing had been taken. It simply wasn't there anymore. Silence followed, dense and charged. Then her tone shifted from accusation to disbelief. She asked if this was a joke, if I was trying to teach her some kind of lesson. I told her it wasn't a joke, and it wasn't a lesson either. It was a decision. My voice sounded steadier than I felt, but not by much. She reminded me, angrily, of everything she had planned, everything she had counted on. I listened, absorbing the weight of her expectations without agreeing to carry them. When she finally demanded I reverse it, I said no. Not loudly, not with anger, just no. That single word felt heavier than all the checks I'd written over the years. She accused me of being controlling, of sabotaging her future out of spite. The words were familiar, echoes of arguments we'd had in different forms when she was younger. Back then, I would have explained myself, tried to soften the blow with context and reassurance. This time, I didn't. I told her she should reach out to the people who had supported her, the ones she thanked publicly for never giving up on her. I said it evenly, without sarcasm. The line went quiet again, then erupted with indignation. She said that was unfair, that this wasn't the same thing. I didn't argue. I simply repeated that I wasn't reversing the decision. When she hung up, she did it abruptly, without goodbye. I set the phone down and finished cooking dinner. That night, sleep came in fragments. I woke once to check the time, once to the distant sound of a car passing, once to the memory of her voice cracking just slightly before she ended the call. Each time, I reminded myself that discomfort wasn't damage. She wasn't in danger. She was facing a reality she'd been shielded from. In the dark, I examined my own feelings carefully, wary of self-justification. I knew it would be easy to frame myself as a martyr or a villain, depending on the angle. The truth was simpler and harder to accept. I had allowed a dynamic to exist because it was easier than challenging it. Now I was challenging it, and that came with consequences I was finally willing to bear. The next morning, a message waited for me before I even left the house. This one was longer, more frantic, full of explanations and bargaining. She wrote about stress, about how she hadn't meant to hurt me, about how everyone was counting on me to fix this. I read it once, then again more slowly. I noticed what wasn't there. No acknowledgement of the years I'd carried this responsibility alone, no curiosity about why I'd finally stepped back. Just urgency, need, expectation. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I went about my day, letting time create space between her demand and my reply. That space felt necessary, protective. By the afternoon, word had reached other parts of the family. My phone buzzed with messages from her mother, carefully worded but unmistakably critical. She asked what I was thinking, how I could do this now, after everything. I read her message and felt a familiar tightening in my chest, the old reflex to defend myself, to justify my choices. I resisted it. I replied briefly, saying I'd made my decision and wouldn't discuss it further. That boundary felt more difficult than canceling the payments. Money had always been easier to manage than emotion. Still, I held it. I knew that once I started explaining, I'd be pulled back into a narrative where my needs were negotiable. That evening, I sat alone in the living room, the television on but muted, watching light flicker across the walls. I thought about how quickly support was redefined as obligation, how applause could erase effort as long as someone else claimed the credit. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired, but lighter. For the first time in a long while, the future didn't look like an endless extension of the past. It looked uncertain, yes, but honest. I knew the fallout wasn't over. There would be more calls, more accusations, more attempts to shift the blame back onto me. But as I turned off the lights and went to bed, one thing was clear. The withdrawal wasn't just financial. It was emotional, and I wasn't putting that back. The knock came just after noon 2 days later. Hard, impatient, the kind that didn't wait for permission. I was at the kitchen table sorting mail when I heard it, each strike against the door landing heavier than the last. I didn't jump. I didn't rush. I knew who it was before I stood up. When I opened the door, my daughter was there, jaw tight, eyes red but dry, her phone already in her hand like evidence. She didn't say hello. She stepped inside as if she still had the right to. "You need to fix this," she said, holding the screen toward me. "Right now." I closed the door behind her slowly, already aware that whatever happened next would redraw lines neither of us could ignore. She paced the living room while I stayed standing near the door, letting her fill the space with words. She talked about deadlines she'd missed, about emails from the university, about how embarrassing it was to have to explain delays to people who assumed she had everything handled. Every sentence circled back to the same demand: give it back. Not ask. Not discuss. Give. I listened without interrupting, noticing how familiar this posture was. Her agitated, me still. It had always worked this way. When she finally paused, breath uneven, she looked at me expectantly, as if waiting for the moment I'd always delivered relief. I didn't. I told her calmly that there was nothing to give back. The money was mine, and I had chosen not to spend it that way anymore. Her reaction was immediate and visceral. She accused me of humiliating her, of choosing the worst possible timing, of making everything about myself. She said I'd ruined something she'd worked for. I didn't correct her version of events, even though I could have. I could have reminded her of the years I worked double shifts, of the rules I enforced so she wouldn't have to learn consequences the hard way. Instead, I let her words hang in the air, heavy and unresolved. When she finally demanded to know why now, why like this, I told her the truth in its simplest form. Because I was done being invisible. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't dramatize it. I just said it and felt the weight of it settle between us. She laughed, sharp and incredulous, as if I'd said something absurd. Invisible, she repeated. You were there. You always paid. That's not invisible. The distinction mattered to me in a way I couldn't fully explain in that moment. Being there financially had never meant being seen. It had meant being useful, replaceable. I told her that showing up wasn't the same as being acknowledged, and that I had spent too long confusing the two. She shook her head, frustrated, insisting I was rewriting history. The conversation felt like two parallel lines running close, but never touching. At one point, her phone buzzed with a message, and she glanced at it before shoving it back into her pocket, irritation deepening. Reality kept intruding, refusing to wait for us to resolve anything. When she realized I wasn't going to reverse the decision, her tone shifted again, this time toward accusation sharpened with threat. She said I was going to regret this, that I was damaging our relationship beyond repair. The words were meant to scare me, and years ago they would have. I had lived with the fear of losing her approval for so long that it had become background noise. Now, hearing it spoken out loud, I felt an unexpected calm. I told her quietly that our relationship had already been damaged, just not in a way she'd been willing to see. That silence, that distance, that assumption, they were cracks that had been forming for years. This was just the moment they became visible. She stared at me as if seeing a stranger, and in some ways, she was. She brought up her mother then, almost as an afterthought, saying she'd talked to her, that they were trying to figure something out. The way she said trying told me more than the words themselves. I seized the opening, not to gloat, but to clarify. I reminded her of the speech, of the people she had chosen to thank publicly. I said, evenly, that those people were the ones she should lean on now. The suggestion infuriated her. She accused me of being petty, of punishing her for a moment she insisted meant nothing. I didn't argue about intent. Intent didn't change impact. I told her that gratitude spoken aloud had consequences, that words shaped expectations. She scoffed at that, but I saw doubt flicker behind her eyes, brief and unwelcome. The argument burned itself out the way these things often did, not with resolution, but with exhaustion. She stood there, arms crossed, staring at the floor as if recalculating her options. Finally, she said she needed time, that she hoped I'd come to my senses. The phrase stung more than I expected, but I let it pass. When she moved toward the door, I followed at a distance, opening it without ceremony. She hesitated on the threshold, as if waiting for one last attempt at reconciliation, one last offer to make things right. I didn't give it. She left without looking back. The door closed softly behind her, the click of the latch sounding louder than the knock had earlier. After she left, I stood there for a long moment, hands still on the door, feeling the echo of the confrontation in my chest. My phone buzzed almost immediately. Another message, this time from her mother, terse and pointed, accusing me of cruelty. I read it, set the phone down, and didn't reply. I had said everything I needed to say out loud. There was nothing to be gained by continuing the argument in text form, stripped of tone and nuance. Instead, I went back to the kitchen table and finished sorting the mail, grounding myself in something ordinary. The world hadn't ended. The house was still standing. The clock still ticked forward. That evening, I replayed the confrontation in my mind once, carefully, then let it go. I resisted the urge to analyze every word, every expression. I knew from experience that doing so only reopened wounds without healing them. Instead, I focused on what had changed. For the first time, I hadn't folded. I hadn't rushed to smooth things over or take responsibility for emotions that weren't mine. That realization came with a mix of relief and grief. Relief that I'd finally drawn a line. Grief for the version of myself who had waited so long to do it. I understood now that disappointment was inevitable, no matter what I chose. At least this way, it wasn't mine alone. Later that night, another call came through from her number. I let it go to voicemail. When I listened to the message, it was shorter than the last. Angry, hurt, accusatory. She said she couldn't believe I was doing this to her, that she didn't know who I was anymore. I deleted the message after listening once. I didn't need to preserve it as proof of anything. I already knew the truth. This was the cost of stepping out of a role I'd been assigned without consent. As I turned off the lights and headed to bed, I felt the weight of that cost settle fully. The fallout wasn't finished, but the boundary was holding, and I knew, even then, that nothing between us would ever be the same again. 3 days later, my phone rang just after midnight, the sound cutting through the quiet like a blade. I had been half asleep, drifting in that space where thoughts lose their edges, and for a brief moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. Something told me not to. When I answered, her voice came through thinner than before, stripped of anger and urgency, replaced by something raw and unsteady. She didn't accuse me this time. She didn't demand anything. She just said my name, once, as if testing whether I would still respond. In that instant, I knew the ground had shifted again. Whatever support she'd expected from elsewhere had not materialized, and the weight of that realization was settling in. She told me she'd gone to her mother and stepfather the day after our confrontation, explaining everything: deadlines, deposits, the sudden gap where my money used to be. She said they'd listened sympathetically, nodding, offering reassurance that things would work out. But reassurance, she admitted now, didn't come with numbers attached. They talked about budgeting, about patience, about how hard times built character. They did not open their wallets. Hearing her describe it, I pictured the scene clearly. The supportive language, the careful distance, the way encouragement could be offered without cost. I said nothing, letting her fill the silence. I wanted her to hear herself say it out loud, to feel the difference between being praised and being backed. She paused often as she spoke, as if waiting for me to interrupt, to step back into the role she'd always relied on. I didn't. Eventually, she told me she'd had to defer her master's program. The word defer landed heavily between us, carrying disappointment, embarrassment, and a sense of failure she wasn't used to owning. She said it wasn't fair, that everything had been lined up, that this setback would ripple forward in ways she couldn't fully articulate yet. I listened carefully, resisting the urge to soften the moment. This was her reality now, unbuffered. I could hear her trying to make sense of it, trying to assign blame in a way that would restore order. When she finally did, she aimed it squarely at me. She said that if I hadn't pulled out at the last minute, none of this would have happened. That I had created a crisis where there didn't need to be one. I let her finish, then told her quietly that the crisis existed long before I canceled anything. It just hadn't affected her until now. The line went silent, heavy with tension. I could almost hear her recalibrating, deciding whether to push back or retreat. When she spoke again, her tone sharpened slightly, asking how I could live with myself knowing I'd derailed her plans. The question was meant to wound. Instead, it clarified something for me. I told her the truth. I could live with it because I had finally stopped living around everyone else's expectations. She didn't accept that answer. She said I was being selfish, that parents were supposed to sacrifice, that I was abandoning her when she needed me most. The words were familiar, recycled from years of smaller conflicts, but they didn't land the same way anymore. I told her that sacrifice without acknowledgement eventually turned into erasure, and that I wasn't willing to disappear quietly anymore. I reminded her, not accusingly, just factually, that she had stood in front of a room full of people and named her supporters. I had hurt her. Everyone else had too. The silence that followed was longer this time, stretched thin by discomfort. I knew she was remembering that moment differently now, replaying it with new context. She said, defensively, that the speech hadn't meant to exclude me, that it was just easier to thank the people who were around more. I almost laughed at that, not out of humor, but recognition. Easier. That word explained more than she realized. It was easier to praise those who were visible, who offered encouragement without friction. Harder to acknowledge the one who enforced limits, who showed up through obligation rather than applause. I told her that ease had consequences, and that this was one of them. I wasn't punishing her. I was stepping out of a narrative that no longer fit me. She accused me of making everything about a single moment. I told her it wasn't about the moment. It was about the years surrounding it. At some point, her voice broke. She said she felt betrayed, that she didn't know how to move forward without the support she'd counted on. The vulnerability in that admission tugged at me, awakening old instincts. I felt the urge to reassure her, to promise that everything would be okay if she just waited. I sat with that urge, examined it, and let it pass. Instead, I told her that moving forward without guaranteed support was part of adulthood, that it wasn't a reflection of her worth but a test of her resilience. I said it calmly, without judgment. She didn't thank me for that perspective. She didn't have to. It wasn't offered for validation. She circled back, again and again, to the idea that I could still fix this, that a simple transfer would undo the damage. Each time, I repeated myself with slight variations, not to persuade her, but to remain consistent. Consistency had always been my language, even when it made me unpopular. I told her I wasn't changing my mind, that this wasn't a pause or a tactic. It was a boundary. She asked if that meant I was done being her father. The question caught me off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because of how stark it was. I told her no, I was done being her safety net, not her father. The distinction mattered, even if she couldn't see it yet. When the call finally ended, there was no dramatic goodbye, just a quiet disconnect, the line going dead without ceremony. I sat there for a long time afterward, phone still in my hand, listening to the hum of the house. I felt a deep, aching sadness. Not for the money, not even for the argument, but for the gap between who she thought I was and who I had always been. I accepted that she might never bridge that gap. That acceptance felt like grief, but also like relief. I didn't need her to understand me to move on. I just needed to stop explaining myself into exhaustion. The next day, I heard through family channels that she was telling people I'd abandoned her, that I'd chosen pride over parenthood. The words traveled faster than the truth ever had. I didn't correct them. I had learned that defending myself only reinforced the idea that I owed explanations. Instead, I focused on my own life, on work, on routines I'd neglected, on the quiet that now felt less oppressive. I noticed small changes in myself, sleeping better, speaking more honestly, no longer flinching when my phone buzzed. These weren't dramatic transformations, just subtle shifts that signaled a deeper realignment. By the end of the week, the story had settled into a version she could live with, even if it painted me poorly. I made peace with that. I understood now that applause could be misleading, that public gratitude didn't always reflect private reality. The people she'd thanked had offered words. I had offered structure. When structure was removed, the difference became undeniable. As I stood at my kitchen window one evening, watching the sky darken, I felt something close to peace. Not because things had turned out well, but because they had turned out honestly. And that honesty, hard-earned and long overdue, was something I could finally carry forward without resentment. The morning I decided it was finished for good didn't arrive with drama or final words. It arrived quietly, almost politely. I woke before my alarm, the house still wrapped in that early-hour hush where everything feels suspended. I sat at the edge of the bed longer than usual, feet on the floor, hands resting on my knees, noticing how calm my body felt compared to the weeks before. There was no knot in my stomach, no rehearsed arguments looping in my head. I picked up my phone, opened it, and stared at the banking app icon for a long moment before deleting it entirely. The motion was simple, almost forgettable, but the meaning wasn't. It marked the end of something I had carried for years. An unspoken obligation that had quietly defined my worth. The days that followed felt unfamiliar in their lightness. Not happy, not triumphant, just lighter. I went to work without checking my phone every hour. I ate meals without bracing for interruptions. When messages came through from family members, I read them without urgency and replied, if at all, on my own timeline. Some were passive-aggressive. Some were openly critical. A few tried to guilt me with reminders of what a good father should do. I noticed how none of them asked how I was doing. That realization didn't anger me the way it once would have. It confirmed what I already knew. My role had never included being considered. And now that I'd stepped out of it, the discomfort others felt was simply the cost of adjustment. I thought often about my daughter during that time, though not in the anxious way I used to. I wondered how she was filling her days, how she was explaining the deferment to friends and classmates. I imagined her frustration, her embarrassment, her need to assign blame somewhere solid. I accepted that I would remain the easiest target. There was a strange peace in that acceptance. I no longer felt compelled to correct her narrative or defend my intentions. I had spent too many years explaining myself to people who benefited from misunderstanding me. This time, I let the story exist without my participation. I understood that boundaries weren't about changing other people's perceptions. They were about changing my own behavior. One afternoon, about a week after our last call, she texted again. The message was shorter, less emotional, more guarded. She said she hoped I was happy with my decision and that she'd figure things out on her own. There was no apology, no acknowledgement, just distance wrapped in resignation. I read it once, then set the phone down. I didn't reply immediately. When I finally did, hours later, my response was simple and deliberate. I told her I believed she would figure things out, and that I wished her well. I didn't offer money. I didn't reopen the conversation. I didn't add emotional cushioning to soften the boundary. The finality of that exchange settled in my chest like a stone, not heavy, but solid. In the weeks that followed, I began to notice how much of myself I had set aside over the years. Small things surfaced first. Interests I'd neglected, friendships I'd allowed to fade, evenings I'd once spent worrying instead of resting. I started reclaiming them slowly, without ceremony. I took longer walks after work. I said no to overtime I didn't need. I spent quiet weekends doing nothing productive at all, learning how unfamiliar that felt. Each small act reinforced the same truth. My value didn't depend on how much I provided for others. That realization had been a long time coming, and it didn't arrive as a revelation so much as a release. There were moments, of course, when doubt crept in. Late at night, I sometimes replayed old memories. The first day of school, the sound of her laughter when she was younger, the pride I felt watching her succeed. Those memories didn't vanish just because the dynamic had changed. They coexisted with the boundary, sometimes uncomfortably. I allowed myself to feel that complexity without trying to resolve it. Love didn't have to mean sacrifice without limit. Caring didn't require self-erasure. These were lessons I had learned too late to apply retroactively, but not too late to live by now. Family gatherings became quieter affairs. Some people avoided the topic entirely. Others tested the boundary with subtle comments or probing questions. I met each one with the same calm consistency. I didn't justify. I didn't argue. I didn't apologize for choosing myself. Over time, the questions slowed. People adjusted, as they always do. The world moved on, indifferent to the drama that had once felt all-consuming. That indifference was strangely comforting. It reminded me that my life was allowed to continue on its own terms, without constant negotiation or explanation. Months later, I heard, indirectly, that my daughter had taken on extra work and reapplied for the program with a different plan. The information reached me through someone else, stripped of emotion and detail. I felt a quiet pride, not because she was struggling, but because she was adapting. I didn't reach out to congratulate her. I didn't need to insert myself back into the narrative to validate it. Growth didn't require my presence, and that realization was both bittersweet and affirming. I had done what I could. Now she was doing what she had to. Looking back, I understood that the graduation speech hadn't been the betrayal. It had been the reveal. It showed me where I stood in her story, and more importantly, where I didn't. I had spent years mistaking endurance for virtue, silence for strength. Drawing the final boundary forced me to confront those misconceptions head-on. It wasn't an act of cruelty. It was an act of honesty, one I owed myself long before I owed it to anyone else. The cost was real, but so was the freedom that followed. I didn't move on out of spite. I moved on because staying would have meant continuing to disappear. And I had reached a point where disappearing felt more damaging than being misunderstood. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, It's that the quiet parent often pays the highest price until they stop paying altogether. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been the one who carried responsibility quietly and learned the cost of being taken for granted, take a moment to like the video so more people can find it. Share it with someone who might need to hear that boundaries aren't abandonment. And if you want more real stories about family, sacrifice, and finally choosing self-respect, subscribe to the channel and stay with us. See you soon in the next story.